Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought that I would review this little video that I found very particularly interesting. This is going to be a video by the boxing channel that I tend to review here and there. Of course, a part of new media slash maybe the LDBC. Although I will say this, Boxing Eagle, in my opinion, even though I tend to disagree with him a certain amount of the times, in my opinion, he's actually not a bad analyzer. I don't think that he's a bad analyzer whatsoever. I just think that a lot of the times he lets his emotion and his bias get in the way. He certainly is a better analyzer than the majority of channels that I tend to see out there, especially Aki TV, Dante's Boxing Nation, who are pretty much two stooges, in my opinion, but it is what it is. Anyways, Boxing Ego is going to talk about Mr. Canelo Alvarez within this video, and we already know that he doesn't really have that much of a liking for Canelo, but I do think that he is going to mention certain things in this video that have some sort of relevance. I do think that it is going to be interesting to talk about. And these next few years, maybe not even next few, but these next 2 to 5 years, depending on how much longer Canelo Alvarez decides to really fight and continue his career, it's going to be very interesting to see where Canelo goes from here. Because, in my opinion, Canelo's career could really turn one of three ways. The first one is that if he does rematch Dimitri Bivol, he's actually able to beat him, and then after that, he actually ended up defeating David Benavidez and Jamal Charlo and those guys, and he eventually becomes in that debatable top 10 fighters of all time range. The second one overall is the Roberto Duran path, to where, in my opinion, and some people would debate Roberto Duran as a top 10 fighter of all time. In my opinion, I think he lost a little bit too many fights for that debate, but I could see the debate. I could see why some people believe that, when it comes down to it. So he could end up losing to Dimitri Bivol, who's probably, maybe a little bit too much for him combined with the skills and with the size. It just may be a little bit too much. And then he ends up beating Jamal Charlo, David Benavidez, and some of those other great 168 pounders, or at least some of those greatly talented 168 pounders, along with Caleb Plant and Billy Joe Saunders and some of the other guys that he beat, of course, in the past, or other guys that maybe you want to mention as well at 160, like a Gennady Golovkin, yada, yada, yada. But of course, he's never going to go back down to 160, at least from what I've heard when it comes down to it. Or it could end up another way, which I don't really know what fighter to compare it to at this current moment in time. But maybe you could compare it a little bit to that of an Oscar De La Hoya or a Miguel Cotto, to where they ended up losing some of the big fights, it just kind of ended up continuing throughout their career. So that's really the question about Mr. Canelo Alvarez. Is he going to have a Muhammad Ali type of trajectory, to where overall he's able to win that big rematch where Muhammad Ali lost to Joe Frazier that first time, and then he was able to come back and surprise a lot of people? Or will his career maybe turn down the Roberto Duran and Julio Cesar Chavez Sr. path, to where they're still going to be looked at as debatable top 10 fighters, but more than likely more top 20 fighters? And once they reach a certain weight class, there seems to be a limitation, which can pretty much happen with any fighter. Or is he going to go down the Oscar De La Hoya, Miguel Cotto, Juan Manuel Marquez, Sugar Shane Mosley path, to where all in all he got some very, very great wins in his career, but at the bottom end of his career, there were certain disappointments that ended up happening, to where he actually does lose to Jamal Charlo. He actually does lose to David Benavidez and Dimitri Bivol. Time will tell. Time will tell. In my opinion, Canelo is always going to be an all-time great fighter, because at the very least, he's always going to be remembered on the Miguel Cotto, Oscar De La Hoya, Juan Manuel Marquez, Sugar Shane Mosley level. He's at least going to be on that level. If you count those guys as all-time great fighters, which in my opinion they would debatably be, then Canelo is right there with them. In fact, right now, I have him above, all of those guys. I have him a league above those guys. But if Canelo does lose a few more fights in his career over these next few years, that ranking could change a little bit. All of a sudden, he's probably right with them instead of a league above them. So it's going to be very interesting. But Mr. Ego talked about some of the most recent statements that Mr. Canelo Alvarez stated about the potential rematch with Dimitri Bivol, which apparently is going to happen at 175 pounds, which I personally think is the right thing to do. But we'll see overall what happens. But anyways, Ego's going to talk about it. Let's tune in.
Bad news for Canelo. Iowa's born ready. Mexican legend Julio Cesar Chavez says he shouldn't rematch Bivol because he definitely could lose again. Canelo says same weight.
The way that Canelo Alvarez is fighting that sparring partner, and I don't necessarily know who that is. Could be Gilberto Soto Ramirez, although I doubt it. But Canelo is going to have to fight Dimitri Bivol like that the whole entire time. He's going to have to stick his lead hand within his face. He's going to have to go to a body attack very early on. He's going to have to put on the pressure 100% of the time. There's not a round, in my opinion, to where he can lay off. And that's going to be very difficult for Canelo, in my opinion. Someone that very clearly has had stamina issues in the past and has to take breaks here and there, and is in there with a guy that can clearly punch and a guy that is very quick, a guy that is very clearly an A-grade athlete, or who is very clearly an A-grade athlete like Dimitri Bivol. And on top of that, he's very highly intelligent. So this is not going to be an easy task for Canelo Alvarez. What I'll say about Canelo is this: if he actually ends up proving me wrong and actually ends up beating Dimitri Bivol in the rematch, which I don't think is an impossibility, I just think it's, not probable at the current moment in time, just with what I've seen. Once again, I'm a logical thinker. I put whatever I think is going to happen out there, not what I feel or not what overall I hope is going to happen. And once again, I don't overall have a personal connection with any of these fighters. There may be certain fighters that I like to watch more than others, and Canelo is one of those fighters. But once again, I'm not going to give you an emotional standpoint here. It is what it is. And once again, my logical inclusion tells me that this is going to be a very difficult task for Canelo Alvarez. If he actually does end up defeating Dimitri Bivol, who is very clearly an A-plus fighter, I don't think that there's any doubt about it, Canelo will probably have to debatably be within my top 10 fighters of all time. And some people may say, wow, that's a very big jump. But if you really think about it, how many fighters would be able to be outweighed or at least overall outsized the way that Canelo Alvarez is? Now, some may say, what are you talking about? Canelo Alvarez balloons up to about 185 pounds. And yes, that is very true. Just like Gervonta Tank Davis, he probably balloons up overall, at least from what I know, to probably about 150 pounds, at least from what I've seen of him, or somewhere around there. But it still overall is a very tough task to beat someone that is a natural light heavyweight when you're not used to facing those type of fighters. And on top of that, is lengthier and bigger than you. That would be like Gervonta Tank Davis if he was trying to beat someone like a prime Keith one-time Thurman. It would be a very difficult matchup. It would be a very difficult matchup. Maybe if you were to say if Gervonta was a bit bigger when it comes down to it, but in my opinion, it's a similar comparison. So this is going to be a very particularly interesting fight for a multitude of reasons. And if Canelo, if he wants to potentially get back on that mountaintop and claim that he is the current number one pound for pound fighter, or overall claim eventually that he's going to get into that top 10, in my opinion, he is eventually, or excuse me, he is going to have to beat Dimitri Bivol. So we'll see what happens. These next few years, it's going to be very telling about where Canelo Alvarez's career is going to go.
He don't care what Julio is talking about. Julio, he moody, yo. Type of brother that aside you with that Julio. That's what I want to talk about in this video. What up, Fight World? It's your boy Ego. In the
Every time I watch a video from this motherfucker, this guy thinks he's like a professional rapper or some shit.
back with some more boxing. SLC, subscribe, like, and comment for the latest and greatest in boxing, I'm the best in the business. Really no company.
Let me state this all in all about Canelo, and it's very clear that Canelo, in my opinion, that he gained some weight in that first fight. I think he thought that overall that it would be a bonus. What Canelo is going to have to do, and this might sacrifice some of his punching power that was from the first fight. It was clear that Bivol was feeling it within the first few rounds, but he's going to have to lose some of that muscle mass. Muscle mass overall, yes, it can be good overall when used in, variation, but he gained way, 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 way too many pounds. Way, way, way too many pounds. Now, Canelo claims that he was not able to train the same because of an injured hand. Do I, necessarily believe that? I believe that the injury was there, but do I believe that that is the main reason why he ran out of stamina? No, I do not. I think that Canelo gained way too much weight, and if Canelo plans on gaining the same amount of muscle mass, the fight is going to end up the exact same. So he's going to have to make some adjustments there. That's the main one that he's going to have to make. Do not add as much muscle as what you did within that first fight.
So make sure you guys come in.
Steroids or not.
Y'all like the content, subscribe. I want to get into quotes from Canelo Alvarez. He did a recent interview, and he was asked about fighting Bivol at 168, 175. The first fight took place at 175. Canelo said, same weight, that's it. And he said, of course I can win.
I think that actually is the best thing that Canelo Alvarez can do. And some people may look at me and they say, they may say, well, what the hell are you talking about? You claim that Canelo Alvarez is probably a little bit too small to beat someone like Dimitri Bivol, so why would the fight not be better at 168 pounds? Because, in my opinion, if you're Canelo, or at least if you're promoting Canelo, you got to think of it like this. If Canelo Alvarez ends up losing that fight at 168 pounds, he loses all of his belts pretty much at that weight division, and on top of that, Bivol is not someone, I'm not saying that he's not a natural light heavyweight, but he's someone that could probably make 168 pounds way easier than someone like an Archibald or someone like an Adonis Stevenson, someone who was decently bulky for the weight division. So if Canelo actually ends up losing to someone like Dimitri Bivol at 168 pounds, it's going to look very, very bad for his marketability. At least if Canelo Alvarez ends up losing at 175 pounds, you can claim, well, the man was trying to be great and, he tried it at that weight class. It didn't work. Obviously, it's a limitation. He clearly is outsized. Now let's move on to 168 pounds. And that's where Canelo Alvarez is really going to have to step it up. At least, there's something of that type of angle to where you can go. But if you drain Dimitri Bivol all the way down to 168 pounds, and if you potentially get dominated at 168 pounds or lose to him, even in a very competitive fight, it's going to look even worse. So, in my opinion, the 175 pounds, I believe that it's better. And on top of that, even if Canelo beat Dimitri Bivol at 168 pounds, I don't think it really would be for much anyway, because he's really not going to get a lot of credit. And in my opinion, Dimitri Bivol still very clearly is a natural 175 pounder. And if Canelo is actually able to win the belt off of Dimitri Bivol, it means that much more for history. So we'll see what happens.
It's not a matter of belief. It's because I know I can. That is my priority now. So, in response to Julio Cesar Chavez, at the beginning, I told you Chavez Sr. said that he might want to avoid Bivol because Bivol might be too much and could beat him again. Canelo responded with this: I have respect for Chavez. I will always respect him. The champion knows that. But in the end, it's not a matter of what he wants. So he's saying that his priority is Dimitri Bivol. He says, this is my priority now. That is something I want to do, and I know I can win because I know how I went into that fight, and I know what I can do and what I will do. I couldn't do things properly because I didn't train as I wanted to because of my injury, my injured hand, and all that. I lacked 1 or 2 rounds to win. I was highly competitive. Since I couldn't have proper training camp,
Well, Mr. Canelo Alvarez, no, you did not lack 1 or 2 rounds because you got thoroughly dominated within that fight. Now, it wasn't the worst loss that I've ever seen anyone take, but in my opinion, it was still very clearly at the minimum 8 rounds to four, and a certain amount of other people would claim that it was even wider than that. I probably would have had it about 8 rounds to four for Dimitri Bivol. So Canelo was competitive for about the first 3 to 4 rounds of the fight. But then, anything after round four, it was a complete, subpar performance for Canelo Alvarez. So no, I'm sorry, but I cannot agree that it was extraordinarily competitive. I cannot agree with that. So Canelo Alvarez overall, once again, he is going to have to realize that he's going to have to be much better than what he was in the first fight.
I won the early rounds and began to get tired. At the end, I'm sure I didn't give my 100%, and he did. Dimitri Bivol can't.
And I do believe that Canelo somewhat believes that to where he believes that he can adjust and that Dimitri Bivol overall cannot. I think that Canelo takes a look at Dimitri Bivol and I think that he believes that Dimitri Bivol somewhat has a one way of fighting in terms of moving in and out and trying to out counter you. And I think that Canelo, that he's more than likely going to probably try to pressure him, which in my opinion is what he is going to have to do. But Dimitri Bivol is not a one-dimensional fighter. Dimitri Bivol, in my opinion, he is a great all-around fighter. He can mix it up with you when he needs to, and at times he will move in and out. He's pretty much a complete package. And in my opinion, if you need a style to beat someone like a Canelo, someone who is a greatly talented fighter, you're going to have someone like a Dimitri Bivol, someone who has clear size over Canelo, someone who has, A-grade athleticism, and on top of that has A-grade intelligence. Even most light heavyweights would not be able to beat Canelo Alvarez. There's only two, in my opinion, that I would favor to beat Canelo: Dimitri Bivol and overall Archibald. Those will be the only ones.
If anything more, and I can. So, the beginning of this year, I made a bold prediction. I said that Canelo era, me era, is over. And this was before the Dimitri Bivol fight and loss.
Well, it's going to be very interesting once again to see where Canelo goes from here because Ego could be potentially right. It could be over. Now, we all know that Boxing Ego and Dante, that they're all preying on Canelo Alvarez's downfall. What I'll say is this: if Canelo ends up losing the Dimitri Bivol rematch, it could be the end of the Canelo era. What I will say is this: it certainly is going to be the end of him being ever in the same discussion as the number one pound-for-pound fighter ever again, at least in my opinion. And it also could be the end of the days to where he is clearly the same face of boxing. It's just probably never going to happen again. However, what I will say is this: I'm not necessarily going to say that if he does lose to Dimitri Bivol in a rematch, that the era of Canelo is necessarily over. Just like I'm going to say that the era of Deontay Wilder is over because there's still some certain big fights that he could potentially win. That's what I'm saying. It's going to be very interesting to see where Canelo goes from here. Does he end up overall going the route to where of Muhammad Ali to where he could, avenge the rematch? Now, of course, Ali probably overall was never in a fight to where he was as outsized overall in terms of both reach and, a little bit of the weight. Now some may say, what are you talking about? He fought George Foreman. Yes, but their physical dimensions were somewhat of the same. And some people may say, well, still, George Foreman probably outweighed him by a good, 15 to 20 pounds. And although that's very true, Muhammad Ali and George Foreman was still very comparable with the height and the reach. And a lot of people don't understand how important that is. Canelo Alvarez, he's not that comparable overall with Dimitri Bivol in terms of the height and reach. So that's why I'm saying, height and reach overall does matter. Certain people always say, well, it's weight classes, not height and reach weight classes. Yes, but both of those things matter. So it is what it is. But anyways, at the end of the day, overall, once again, it is going to be very, very particularly interesting, to see how Canelo does there. Is it going to be the Muhammad Ali path to where he avenges the loss? Is it going to be the Roberto Duran, Julio Cesar Chavez path to where overall he wasn't able to beat, overall that one guy, but then later on he's still able to accomplish some very great things? Or will he never be the same after this loss if he does lose to Dimitri Bivol and he'll go down the Oscar De La Hoya, Miguel Cotto, Juan Manuel Marquez route to where maybe he's shown to not be quite as great as what I once originally thought. Once again, any one of those possibilities are possible. So it's going to be very interesting.
With Canelo saying what he just said, I believe that to be the case even more so. Because what Canelo is saying sounds completely devoid of any rational thinking and deluded. Sounds very delusional. Let's pick a
Well, overall, to be a great fighter and to be great in the first place, you have to be a little bit delusional. I understand what ego is saying. What I'll actually state is this: I actually don't believe that what Canelo Alvarez is saying is 100%, in my opinion, unrealistic. I think that Canelo, at least with the way that he sees it, I think that he sees overall Dimitri Bivol overall as a guy that, probably is not going to bring much adjustments in the rematch, which, in my opinion, I think Bivol is probably going to be more of the same in the rematch than what Canelo Alvarez is overall if I had to put my money on it. So I understand where Canelo Alvarez is coming from. But if I were Canelo, I also would overall not underestimate. Well, I don't think he's going to underestimate at this point. But Canelo also needs to understand that, yes, Dimitri Bivol is going to make adjustments. And more than likely, he's going to try to put the pressure on more with Canelo Alvarez this time as well. That's why this fight is going to be very particularly interesting. Because both fighters, in my opinion, really to beat one another, they really need to put the pressure on each other. So who is going to win the battle of the pressure? It's going to be very interesting.
part what he said because you know me, I'm a sniper. So I listen to the linguistics and I listen to what you're telling me and apply it, rational thinking, to see if it makes sense. So, one, he
Well, you're not always known for your rational thinking, but I agree with you at least partially on this situation. But go ahead.
just said that he was injured. And he also said that Bevel, quote, can't give anything more, and I can. So just because Bevel didn't come out and declare an injury, he won the fight. So you don't know, he could have got knocked out in sparring. He could have been nursing an injury. Because I know a lot of fighters who have injuries and they go into these fights. You know, even in the UFC, I know it's a different sport, still a combat sport. Francis Ngannou, he wore a knee brace to one of his fights recently, and he had some kind of knee injury, and he still won the fight. So true champions find a way, and they have to have their best poker face. The only
Well, listen, what I'm going to say is this. I don't think that Dimitri Bivol had any sort of injury in the match. At least, I did not notice any. Doesn't mean that he didn't have any. Of course, you don't really know what's going on with any of these fighters behind the scenes. But what I will say about this, and, what Canelo Alvarez does have to be worried about is this. Dimitri Bivol is going to be more confident within this rematch. He just is. Dimitri Bivol, with not even overall putting on the pressure quite as much as what he did against Gilberto Zurdo Ramirez, he was able to beat Canelo Alvarez at least at a minimum 8 rounds to 4, when it came down to it. So, or at a maximum, if you want to give Canelo the maximum amount of 4 rounds. Some would give him 5. I don't think that I would be that generous to give him 5 rounds within that fight. So Canelo is going to have to expect a more aggressive Dimitri Bivol within this rematch. And if he thinks all in all that that isn't going to happen, then it's going to be his downfall. Because Dimitri Bivol is going to be more aggressive. Canelo has to make him very uncomfortable early. I thought that his defense was very good within the 4 rounds of the fight. Everything after that, his defense was still there, but he was so damn tired a lot of the times he couldn't even keep his hands up. So once again, he's going to have to be decently aggressive. He's going to have to pace himself very well. He's going to have to stick that lead hand to the body and to the face. He's going to have to get a body attack out there very early on, go to the arms overall, and you're going to have to try to get Dimitri Bivol to somewhat fear you. Because if Dimitri Bivol, in my opinion, does not fear Canelo Alvarez's power within this fight, or if he consistently pushes him back, Dimitri Bivol is going to clearly win the fight.
Making excuses is Canelo, I was born ready. Well, apparently you weren't born ready because you're making excuses. Floyd Mayweather, I know for a fact because I know many people who have been around Floyd, he has entered fights with the same kind of thing where his hands were hurt or, injuries in sparring, things like that. Gervonta Davis, someone who's younger than Canelo, ask him. He entered the fight with Isaac Pitbull Cruz, which was a late replacement, having messed up his hand in sparring. Ask him, in sparring, and then the hand, it basically re-injured in the fight, hitting Isaac Pitbull Cruz's hard-ass head. You know what I'm saying? So this is nothing new. Ask Devin Haney in the Gamboa fight if he entered.
I'll tell you what, Isaac Pitbull Cruz looks like an alien. Isaac Pitbull Cruz is one of the weirdest looking boxers I think overall that I've personally ever seen. Anyway.
The fight with any injuries, and so on and so forth. But the difference is Tank and Devin Haney, those American fighters that I just named, and Floyd Mayweather, they found a way to win despite the odds, despite everything else. Canelo is saying, oh, I could have did better because of my injury. So again,
well, right, but Canelo Alvarez overall is in a predicament to where, this is a very, very tough fight. This is pretty much overall, if I were to make a comparison, this would overall, if I'm trying to think of one, this would almost be like Oscar De La Hoya trying to beat Bernard Hopkins in a rematch. It's a very, very tough predicament. But I do have to agree with Ego a little bit here that I'm not really necessarily buying the 100% of my hand was injured to the degree to where I cannot train fully. I'm not necessarily sure if I'm believing that. Of course, obviously, something was up with his stamina, but I think it was more of a fault with gaining way too much weight.
How can you say that only you can get better, but Dimitri Bivol can't? Bivol.
Well, at the end of the day, that's Canelo Alvarez's opinion. I don't really have a problem with it, but I also don't have a problem with Mr. Ego disagreeing with that. And I do have to agree with Mr. Ego. Dimitri Bivol, just as Canelo Alvarez, also can bring adjustments to the table. And I expect a better version of both Canelo Alvarez and Dimitri Bivol within this fight. There's certain rematches that happen to where the better fighter probably lost the first fight because they didn't take him that seriously. Like when Conor McGregor ended up losing to Nate Diaz. I knew that Conor, in my opinion, was more than likely going to beat Nate Diaz in the rematch because Nate Diaz, there's no offense against him, but he's not really the sharpest tool in the shed. Nate Diaz and Nick Diaz, not calling them necessarily stupid necessarily, but when it comes to their fight IQ, I don't think that they have the highest of fight IQ. And their skill set has been very limited throughout the years. And I knew that Conor, who was the more intelligent person and the more intelligent fighter, he more than likely was going to come better and more prepared in the rematch, and Nate Diaz pretty much was going to stay the same. Well, I don't see that here. I think that both Dimitri Bivol and Canelo Alvarez, that they're going to be better versions of themselves than what they were within that first fight. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens.
Been fighting his whole life too, and he beat you soundly. Another thing that sounds diluted from Canelo is he's saying that he did great in the early half of the fight, but then he got tired, right?
Well, I think that Canelo Alvarez was very competitive within the first 3 to 4 rounds. I don't think that there's any debate about that. I think that Canelo had a very good 4 rounds of the fight, but then after that, everything was downhill. So Canelo saying that he believes that he was 1 or 2 rounds away from winning that fight, no, sir, you weren't. And I don't care what the judges stated or what they scored it. No, Canelo Alvarez was not 1 or 2 rounds away from winning that fight. He very clearly lost.
He says that the fight was highly competitive. The fact that you think that fight was highly competitive shows me another problem. Because from where I'm standing, rather, that fight wasn't close. And I thought
I would tend to agree.
Bivol beat the brakes off him. And if anything, Bivol's confidence should have only grown because he secured his belt by beating 2 Mexican fighters that only had 1 loss between them back to back. And that was Canelo. Payday, you want pay? His only loss on record was to Floyd Mayweather and then Gilberto Zordo Ramirez. These are the only people that there's one loss between the two of them. And he just beat Zordo, who's bigger than Canelo, and he made that look easy.
You know, Zordo Ramirez, after that fight, and maybe I'm wrong about him, this isn't me stating that he is not a decently skilled fighter, but after looking at that fight and the way that he got so purely dominated, what Zordo Ramirez really reminds me of is pretty much a paper tiger. He pretty much was hyped up after all these years because he was like 44-0 and all this other bullshit, but just like I said, overall, I don't really know how truly great he is because all the guys that he pretty much fought were pretty much washed up. It just it is what it is. And I know the difference between fighters that are washed up and still decent contenders. Zerto Ramirez was fighting washed up guy after washed up guy after washed up guy. So Zerto Ramirez, it's going to be really interesting to see where he goes from here. And if he's able to beat overall some of the other guys like a Better Beef, in my opinion, he wouldn't stand a chance against Better Beef. But even if he's able to beat Anthony Yard or even certain guys at cruiserweight, because he could potentially easily move up to cruiserweight. I don't think there's any debate about that. The man looked overall like a damn heavyweight in there against Dimitri Bivol.
As well. So his confidence should be at an all-time high. So who is Canelo? He's saying that, oh, Chavez Jr. or Chavez Sr. can have his own opinion, but it's not up to him. So using that same logic.
Well, I agree it's not up to Chavez Sr. Chavez Sr. doesn't dictate Canelo Alvarez's actions. But Chavez Sr., I don't think he's necessarily coming from a bad spot. I just think that he's stating his beliefs, and I would tend to share the same beliefs. I don't think that Canelo's going to win the Dimitri Bivol rematch. It wouldn't shock me. Once again, I give him a 30% chance. But overall, just with what I've seen from the first fight, and just with the size and overall, I just don't know if Canelo, in my opinion, is going to beat him. But anything's possible.
It's not up to you to say that only you can improve and get better. But Dimitri Bivol, who's on a tear, and it looks like the Canelo win, then the Zordo Ramirez win, that should have only woke his game up because he beat two good fighters that were ranked back to back.
Actually, he beat one good fighter and one great fighter. But anyways, when it comes down to it all in all, I understand where Canelo Alvarez is coming from, and I can see a little bit of realism from his point. But Dimitri Bivol is going to come in as a better fighter.
So he's on a tear. So I think it sounds foolish for Canelo to say only he can improve, because again, you don't know if Bivol was injured. What else did he say that?
Well, right, but we're not going to go off an assumption of Dimitri Bivol was injured. But the logical thing, in my opinion, to state is that it's very clear. And I had certain comments overall state to where they said it's very clear that that fight was fixed and that Dimitri Bivol, that he wasn't throwing all of his might into it. No, he was throwing a lot of his might into the punches, but you could clearly tell that Dimitri Bivol a lot of the times was a little bit uncomfortable. Not saying that he wasn't throwing his full might into his punches, but they maybe were not quite as accurate as what they potentially could be, because he's saying, I need to figure Canelo Alvarez out, overall. And, he's trying to figure out, what ends up happening. And that's why a lot of the times in the first fight between two great fighters or two very decent fighters, it's very competitive. And then in the rematch, it's not competitive whatsoever. Because, a lot of the times in the first fight, they're trying to say, okay, what can you really bring to the table? But then in the rematch, they're like, okay, now I pretty much know everything that you can do. Or I know a lot of the things that you can do. That's why a lot of the times rematches end up not being as competitive. So we'll see what happens.
Didn't make sense to me. Again, him saying the fight was highly competitive, I
And
did
if Canelo Alvarez ended up losing this fight 10 rounds to 2 or 11 rounds to 1, it would not surprise me whatsoever.
agree. I don't think he was winning early rounds. I thought he looked like Teofimo versus Cambosis. You went out there and trying to blaze somebody, which also makes me not believe.
I would agree when it comes down to it. I would agree with that. But what that also tells me is that you probably believe that Canelo can do a little bit better. So it is what it is. I do believe that Canelo was winning a lot of the earlier rounds. In fact, I believe that he pretty much won every single early round from round 1 to round 4. But once again, he's going to have to be better than that. And he has to expect a better version of Dimitri Bivol.
Leave the injury scoop, because how is it these fighters like Teofimo Lopez and Canelo, who are making these excuses post-fight for why they lost, it seems like you're just having a tough time coming to grips with the loss? Because here's the thing.
Well, I don't necessarily have a problem with you stating that, Mr. Ego, but once again, let's let's not overall throw stones overall when we live in a glass house, because we all know when it came to your boy Deontay Wilder, overall, you were basically making every excuse overall over the moon to come up with why Deontay Wilder was getting his ass whooped. But I do have to agree with Ego here overall. But Tiafimo, in my opinion, his excuses were clearly more shameful. At least with Canelo, in my opinion, it's very clear that there was a stamina issue. Now, do I agree that overall that more than likely it was completely due to his hand? No, I think that he just tried to gain way too much weight. But when it comes down to it once again, we'll see overall what ends up happening.
When Teofimo fought Cambosis, he came out reckless in
Now,
round.
what I will say about Teofimo Lopez is that, in my opinion, he very clearly overall did not take Cambosis very seriously. But in my opinion, I can't really use that as an excuse because overall there was no physical deficiencies. In my opinion, the only deficiency was your arrogance.
One, like trying to blaze and just get Cambosis out of there. Canelo did the same thing, and he was throwing hard as hell. But Bevo, being a good fighter, great 1-2 foot movement, good fundamentals, he just wasn't accepting that, and he wasn't there to just be.
Well, what happened in the first Dimitri Bivol fight is that Canelo, in my opinion, was outboxing Dimitri Bivol within the first 3 to 4 rounds. But then after that, he completely blew his whole stamina load when it came down to, and then after that, Dimitri Bivol was pretty much able to tee off on him. So I think that's what Canelo Alvarez believes. I believe that overall to a degree as well. It's very clear that his stamina was horseshit in that first fight, but that doesn't mean that Canelo is going to win the rematch just because his stamina is better. Dimitri Bivol is going to be a better version of himself, and Canelo needs to prepare for that.
Hit. He was, using upper body movement, blah, blah, blah. So if you're so injured, how are you coming out with so much, these cannon haymaker shots? That makes me not believe it. Like, if you're injured,
Well, I didn't really see any haymaker shots in the final half of the fight. Once again, after those first 4 rounds, Canelo was so done in terms of stamina. I don't remember one really good power shot overall that Canelo Alvarez landed after the first 4 rounds. His hands were not even up half of the time, which happens a lot when fighters are very exhausted.
why not test things out and things like that? How you coming trying to gun somebody down in broad daylight if you're so injured? And you're not even wincing.
Well, in my opinion, it really wasn't the injury when it came down to it overall. It was just the fact that he tried to gain too much weight. And I don't really think that that's an excuse. It's very clear, once again, that his stamina was very largely affected. Because Canelo at times will lay up against the ropes to kind of take a break and regain his stamina. But throughout the majority of that fight, when Canelo laid up against the ropes, and once I started seeing that in round 5 or round 6, I said, uh-oh, he's in trouble. Because Dimitri Bivol, he's not going to let off the gas.
When you're throwing these shots. Versus, we've seen fighters who are nursing injuries in the fight or picked up injuries in the fight, and every time they throw, you can see the pain, and it's an effort being made to throw with the injury that they have. Like every time they throw, like you see the grunts and the winces and stuff like that. So I don't even believe the injury. Furthermore, using
Well, I think that Canelo Alvarez had calluses on his hands. I just don't think, all in all, that it was enough overall to stop throwing punches. The reason why Canelo Alvarez stopped throwing punches in a lot of the second half of the fight is because he didn't have the stamina. And if Canelo Alvarez would have blew any more of a load overall throughout the second half of that fight, he probably would have got stopped.
what Canelo's saying with the injury stuff is how did you go not only the
For those of you for that remember Miguel Cotto's career, Miguel Cotto, I believe, had a left shoulder injury, which was his main good overall arm. That was his main good punch, the left hook, and also he had a tremendous jab. Miguel Cotto overall was pushing off the shoulder injury for years, or the shoulder surgery. Then he finally got the shoulder surgery, and he was a little bit better. So I don't think that the calluses are necessarily something to where, all in all, it's a traumatic injury. It's just something overall a little bit of a nuisance. And I think that Canelo overall believes that in his mind that because of superstition, that he believes that the calluses probably maybe cost him a little bit. But there also is a little bit of delusion there. Because in my opinion, Canelo, once again, it wasn't mainly the calluses that, in my opinion, caused his stamina to go. It was the fact that he gained way, way, way too much muscle mass. Canelo's going to have to be more the size of what he was in the Gennady Golovkin trilogy and in the Caleb Plant fights in order to win the Dimitri Bivol rematch.
Bivol fight and loss, but you fought a 40-year-old Golovkin who gave you 2 tough fights, and really the third fight in the back half was tough. How'd you go into the triple?
Well, not really. a lot of people overall claim that the back half was tough. Not really. There was about 3 rounds overall, to where Gennady gave it a little bit more of an effort. There was 1 round I think I gave Gennady that whole entire fight. And it was very clear that Canelo, I thought, was carrying Gennady Golovkin. Not saying that he was clearly not trying to land some good punches. He was, but overall, I don't think that Canelo Alvarez, I don't think that he was at his full capacity. I think that overall that it was somewhat agreed upon that, he would make Gennady Golovkin look a little bit better than overall what he did, or that overall that he would not go for the stoppage. And some people may say you're crazy. That's a stupid ass take. But there's certain fighters that do that. Just the way overall that I seen it, and just the way that I seen them talk to each other afterwards, and just the way that it was promoted, it was very clear that they wanted both fighters to look as good as possible.
G fight straight away in May and September with the same injury. And then you waited, so you had an injury before the Bivol fight. You fought Bivol and lost, blamed the loss on the injury, but then you fought Golovkin without getting the surgery. Because if you look at all the surgery,
I tend to agree with that. And what that does show is that the injury is not significant enough, in my opinion, for you to mainly lose stamina. But he did clearly lose stamina in that first fight, but I cannot agree with the injury excuse. I agree.
stuff, it was after the Golovkin fight. So if this was such a bad injury and nagging injury that was preventing you from showcasing your true talent, why would you, one, go into the Bivol fight, which is stupid? You're Canelo Alvarez. You're supposed to be the face of boxing. People had you ranked number one. So that's a huge risk as opposed to postponing the fight. Hey, I'm injured. Sorry to disappoint, but we got to reschedule this. I'm Canelo Alvarez, right? But beyond that, you went to a second.
I think all in all that all Canelo Alvarez is saying, at least in his mind, is that it's somewhat of a superstition. Well, he's not really saying that to the public, but I think in Canelo's mind, it at least somewhat makes sense. Because overall, if you're a person that is very competitive, let's say that you play video games, for example. If you play Call of Duty or, some sort of competitive video game when it comes down to it. If you play, like, let's say on a different type of controller or something when it comes down to it, it's going to feel a little bit different to you. So I think Canelo, that he's been dealing with the injury for quite a while, but he was overall able to sustain it because the fighters that he was fighting probably were not on his same level. And I don't think that anyone at 168 or 160 is on Canelo Alvarez's level. Now he finally came across a fighter that is on his same level when it came down to it. And now overall that he lost to him, he said, I wonder if the hand injury overall was something. Now, I agree with Ego a little bit that in my opinion it is a little bit of an excuse. But I think that in Canelo's mind, there's a little bit of realism there.
Fight with the 40-year-old Golovkin with the same injury before you got it repaired. So to me,
whereas Deontay Wilder, for example, a lot of the bullshit excuses that he was making, I don't think he believes it at all.
That's a cop-out. Canelo had two back-to-back poor or mid performances where he got tired.
No, he had one very poor performance and one very good performance. Once again, I don't know why so many people always try to say that this performance was not good. I don't understand. Canelo very clearly beat Gennady Golovkin very dominantly. In my opinion, it was about 11 rounds to 1. Very clearly.
And now to his radical fan base, oftentimes some of his fans could be racist as well and biased. You have to.
Well, I can somewhat agree with that, Mr. Ego, but once again, let's not throw any stones or let's not throw any rocks overall for those of us that live in a glass house. Let's not talk about racial bias here, Mr. Ego. You of all people.
Keep them.
You, Mr. Deontay Wilder lover, you.
Hoping. So now you have to come up with these excuses as to why you look subpar or mid. So you have to say, oh, my hand was bad, to keep the faith within your base,
Well, I think Canelo was doing that to keep the faith within himself, because I think he knows that Dimitri Bivol, that there's a decent chance that Bivol is going to be the hardest test of his career, and there's a possibility that he may not be able to get out of this one. So it's going to be very interesting.
But to me, when Wilder, quote unquote, made excuses, old media was like, oh, Wilder, all he does is make excuses. But some of the...
Well, I agree with that, Mr. Ego, but let's also be real here. You were full on board with the Wilder excuses, at least with a lot of them. You still claim to this day that Tyson Fury cheated. You still claim to this day that he messed with his gloves. You still claim to this day, all in all, that Deontay Wilder, that he was wrong. So let's cut the bullshit.
Ain't people. They not saying nothing to Canelo. He's supposed to be the face of boxing.
Agreed, but once again, one could say the same thing for you. You're claiming Canelo was making excuses, but then when it comes overall to Deontay Wilder, where was that same energy? It was nowhere to be found. So let's not judge others, sir, when you're very much overall doing the same shit, because that makes you a hypocrite.
Make it make sense. Best in the business. I make boxing look good. I make this look pretty. Subscribe to the channel because I'm the best doing it, and that's just the way it is. As always, hate, comment, and subscribe.
But anyways, that's really about it for today. I just thought that that'd be a very particularly interesting video. I do agree with some of the points that Mr. Ego was making. And the hand excuse overall that Canelo was saying, I'm not saying that he does not believe that there is a little bit of realism there. But I think that Canelo also knows that, the main reason why he lost to Bivol is because this dude's just a tough SOB. And Canelo, I think that he believes that he's going to be the best version of himself within the rematch. I think that there's a part of him that maybe is lying to himself a little bit, which sometimes is necessary to get to great places. It just is what it is, and some people may not understand that, but it is what it is. However, Canelo also does need to be realistic with himself. He also does need to be realistic overall to a degree to where he needs to say that more than likely Bivol is going to come into the rematch as a better fighter. Now, there's no problem with saying that he can win the fight, but he is going to have to expect a better version of Dimitri Bivol. So once again, this fight is going to be very particularly interesting. Canelo cannot be afraid of Dimitri Bivol's power. He's going to have to go in there, and he's really going to have to try to plow Dimitri Bivol over. That's what he's really going to have to try to do. And Dimitri Bivol is going to have to try to do the same thing to Canelo while moving in and out. So it's going to be very interesting. But anyways, that's really about it for today. I just thought that I would review that. It's going to be very, very particularly interesting. But anyways, we'll see what happens. Thought I would talk about that. I'll talk to you all later.